Hey everybody, Andy here at the American Battlefield Trust. We're here at the Chattanooga National Cemetery with our guest Dave Powell. While my colleagues have been out filming the videos for the Georgia Battlefield Swing, Dave and I have been working on our brand new Chickamauga driving tour, which brought us here to the cemetery. So we figured while we were here, we might as well shoot a video for the tour swing as well. So with that, Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. This monument was erected by the state of Ohio in 1890 to commemorate the Andrews Raiders. In 1862, James J. Andrews, a civilian, conceived of the idea of capturing a locomotive on the Western and Atlantic Railroad running from Atlanta to Chattanooga. At the time, the plan was to steal the locomotive, run north along the tracks, destroying bridges, doing whatever damage, water tanks, whatever, if they had time to tear up rails, to do whatever damage they could. Even in 1862, the Confederate armies in Tennessee depended on the Western and Atlantic as their supply line. The Andrews Raiders were just one of several attempts to cut that supply line. The raid was comprised mostly of men from the 2nd, 21st, and 33rd Ohio. They gathered in Big Shanty, Georgia. Today it's known as Kennesaw, Georgia. And they stole the locomotive, the General. The Confederates realized the capture almost immediately and gave chase. And so the Andrews Raiders were not able to achieve many of their objectives. They embarked on a race northward to try and outrun the Confederate locomotive, ultimately several locomotives pursuing them. But in the end, they were captured just outside of Ringgold, Georgia. And they were taken to Atlanta. A number of the raiders, 8 of the raiders were ultimately executed in Atlanta, including James J. Andrews, who was a civilian, and 7 members of mostly the 2nd Ohio, I believe. In 1863, many of these men who escaped would be returned to service in the Union Army. Several of the men in the 21st Ohio would actually be captured again at the Battle of Chickamauga on September 20th, 1863, when their regiment was captured on Horseshoe Ridge. So a number of men, several of them, got a second trip to Atlanta and ultimately to the prison camps of the Confederacy. 8 Medals of Honor were awarded to the Raiders. The Medal of Honor was actually created in 1862, and the first Medals of Honor were issued to these Raiders. And ultimately, though the raid wasn't successful, it became one of the more dramatic episodes of the Civil War. We're here in the National Cemetery. The Chattanooga National Military Cemetery was created in 1864, first to bury the dead of the Chickamauga and the Chickamauga campaign and the fighting around Chattanooga, the battles for Wauhatchie, Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, and the other fighting, and ultimately much of the dead of the 1864 Atlanta campaign would also be buried here. And ultimately, it's still an active national military cemetery today. There are still burials, interments that occur. Perhaps the most famous story about the National Cemetery is that when George H. Thomas was commanding the Army of the Cumberland in early 1864, and the idea was conceived to create this national cemetery to bury all these war dead, Chaplain Van Horn, who was a member of George Thomas's 14th Corps, asked General Thomas whether they should organize the burials by state section or by individual. And Thomas is reputed to have said, after a moment's thought, "Mix them up, I'm tired of states' rights." Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust, and we are on our western swing. We've been hitting some great sites around Chickamauga and Chattanooga. And we're right about time to close off the Chattanooga campaign, and this is going to be November 27th of 1863. Something else is happening out in the east that Chris Bukowski knows a little bit about, and that's the Battle of Mine Run. So we have some simultaneous campaigning going on in the east around Mine Run, which is on the Wilderness Battlefield, and members of the American Battlefield Trust help to preserve land there at Mine Run. But out here where we're standing on the land, at a place called Ringgold Gap, which is out here near Chattanooga. What we're doing is wrapping up the Chattanooga campaign. If you haven't seen it before, make sure you go back and watch our video from Orchard Knob. We were up there with Chris Bukowski, Will Green, Dave Powell, talking about the actions from Orchard Knob. You can see everything from there, from Lookout Mountain into downtown Chattanooga, down to Billy Goat Hill, and of course Missionary Ridge. So what we've had happen is that to sum it up very quickly, we've had Lookout Mountain fall to Joe Hooker and his forces that came in from the Eastern Theater. Now we have William T. Sherman picked the wrong hill and attacked Billy Goat Hill, but then eventually George Henry Thomas and his Army of the Cumberland are going to attack up Missionary Ridge and dislodge Braxton Bragg and his Confederate Army of Tennessee. This is really the last hurrah for Braxton Bragg and the Army of Tennessee. And now we have to start pulling out of Chattanooga if we're Bragg. We got to get the Army out of here, back to safety, back towards Georgia and back towards Atlanta, that vital rail center as well as his supply center, so that we can keep this army together to fight on into 1864. So without further ado, I want to bring on Will Green. Will, we're standing beside a monument to a guy that most people know about. Chris Bukowski grudgingly has to accept that he's the Stonewall of the West. But Patrick Cleburne, and Cleburne out here is playing an integral role, yet again, trying to save the Confederate Army of Tennessee.
Absolutely. Incidentally, Chris, I've never heard Jackson referred to as the Cleburne of the East.
I don't know why.
Some of my friends out here in the Western Theater have a little chip on their shoulder, but I point that out to them. Anyway, here he is, the Irishman from Arkansas, who, as Chris said, plays the key role here at the Battle of Ringgold Gap on the 27th of November. This statue, incidentally, was about 12 years in the making. A Patrick Cleburne Society was raising the money for it. The Georgia Historical Commission chipped in. And finally, in October of 2009, the Cleburne statue was erected here, crafted by the famous sculptor Ron Tunison, who you might remember as doing a number of monuments on Civil War battlefields, including the Irish Brigade Monument at the Sunken Road at Antietam and the Soldier Monument, the entrance to the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier at Pamplin's Historical Park. Now, the reason that they selected this particular location for the Cleburne statue is this was publicly owned land, and it has been a publicly owned spot since the mid-1930s. And if Chris Bukowski behind the camera here can move over, we'll point out this wonderful bronze plaque, which is one of 5 pocket parks that were called in the 1940s the Atlanta Campaign National Historic Site, administered by the Park Service, but originally erected by the WPA during the Depression in the 1930s. And there are 5 of these pocket parks located along the old Dixie Highway. Highway 41, which is adjacent to our park here, is a part of the old Dixie Highway. And there is one here, there is one at Mill Creek Gap, there is one at Cassville, there is one at Resaca, and there's one at New Hope Church. Now, nothing really became of these. The Park Service abandoned them, and the Georgia Department of Transportation now administers these sites. And they're in various stages of repair, but they all feature really a very helpful map and a short text about what happened at those particular sites. And what happened here is they talk about the beginning of the Atlanta campaign, but as Chris indicated, I think really the story here is the end of the Chattanooga campaign. And as Chris correctly points out, the Confederate Army is retreating off of Missionary Ridge. Braxton Bragg's goal is to get to Dalton, behind a formidable rise of Rocky Face Ridge. But he needs to buy time for all of his wagons and all of his supplies to make their ponderous way down to Dalton, another 10 miles or so to the southeast of us. The place that you could defend between Chattanooga and Dalton is right here at a place called Ringgold Gap. Now, Ringgold is the town that's a half a mile to the north of us. It's the county seat of Catoosa County. It was almost as large as Chattanooga in 1860. It had about 2,500 people. Nice little town then and today. But as you left Ringgold going to the southeast, you passed in a very narrow gap behind me, Taylor's Ridge, and in front of me and behind Chris, White Oak Mountain. And this, today, the Interstate 75 goes through Ringgold Gap, and so it's much, much larger than it was in 1863. But at that time, it was just the road and the boundary of East Chickamauga Creek off here to my left behind us in the woods. So it was a very narrow choke point for any army that was going to try to pursue towards Dalton. And because Pat Claiborne is Pat Claiborne, and he had done so well almost at every battlefield, Bragg gave his division of 4,100 men the assignment of buying time so that Bragg's wagons and all of his straggling troops could get to Dalton. So Claiborne arrives here on the 26th. We're 8 miles or so from Chattanooga here, 8 or 9 miles, and he brilliantly deploys his 4 brigades here. And he did the same thing. He was just a master at placing his troops in the best possible position. He did it at Tunnel Hill, Missionary Ridge. He does it again here at Ringgold Gap. So what he does, he sends Hiram Granberry's Texas Brigade off to the north at White Oak Mountain, at the base of the mountain, with the 7th Texas up on top of the mountain as sort of a mobile reserve. He sends the 16th Alabama of Mark Lowry's brigade up to the slopes of Taylor's Ridge, to shoot down on the gap from there. He places the rest of Lowry's brigade and Lucius Polk's brigade in reserve here behind the gap, and he puts the brigade of Arkansans under Govan right here concealed in the gap itself. He placed a couple of Napoleons of Goldthwaite's battery, there used to be Semple's Alabama battery, hidden right along the road leading to it was concealed, leading to the gap itself. And he had this position established by the morning of November 27th. The pursuers were Joe Hooker's men, who had really not been heavily engaged on the 25th and Missionary Ridge. They were fresh, they were eager, and so Grant told Hooker to pursue the retreating Confederates and to try to interdict their withdrawal to Dalton. Hooker arrives 6 o'clock in the morning at Ringgold. Now, another thing that Claiborne did was he advanced a couple of hundred cavalry. I think they were Kentucky cavalry. 9th Kentucky, if my memory serves me correct, out in front of Ringgold. And he told them that when the Federals approached, retreat in panic. Make it seem like we're running for our lives here. And as Hooker comes up to Ringgold, 8 o'clock in the morning, he's in the town, and there's those Confederate cavalry, and they are retreating rapidly. This gives Hooker the idea that the Confederates are on the run, and before his artillery had even arrived on the scene, Hooker orders an assault. Now he's going to send Wood's brigade off to the left, his left, towards White Oak Mountain, and he's going to send the 13th Illinois to come barreling right through the narrow gap where the road runs. Well, long story short, we don't want to get into the weeds here on the tactics, but suffice it to say that Wood's men are repulsed. Hooker will send additional units farther to the north on White Oak Mountain. This compels Claiborne to use his mobile reserve. The rest of Lowry's brigade and all of Polk's brigade, he sends them up to White Oak Mountain, and they repulse these Federal attacks. And that's where the most vicious fighting takes place at Ringgold Gap. None of that land, unfortunately, is preserved. It's all a residential area now. there's no point in going up there because we can't show you anything. But that's where the serious fighting, one Union regiment lost 50% of its troops in these attacks. So there was some pretty significant fighting up there. When that failed, Hooker said, well, I'm going to send a couple of these eastern brigades, David Ireland's brigade of New York troops, the same guys that were at Culp's Hill and Gettysburg, and he's going to send them straight up the road towards Ringgold Gap. And Claiborne is sitting there and he tells Goldthwait, he says, hold your fire. And he said, now, open on them, when they got to within about 50 yards of the battery. The masked battery fires canister, and these New Yorkers are tumbled down in a terrible repulse. There's actually a monument, perhaps the most isolated portion of the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, is a small monument to Ireland's brigade that is at the spot, near the spot where they met their demise. So Claiborne is doing a wonderful job here, but then Hooker's artillery starts coming up and starts bombarding the position. Just then, word arrives from the rear to Claiborne that the Army is safe at Dalton. There's no need to continue the delaying action here. So Claiborne disengages very competently, moves back to Dalton. Grant, by this time, has arrived in Ringgold, and he tells Hooker, don't follow him, the campaign is over. Hooker will lose more than 500 men in this fight. Claiborne will lose about 200 men. But this is another example. If you're toting up all of the brilliant tactical performances of Patrick Claiborne, this has got to be on your list. So the Battle of Ringgold Gap ends, and the Chattanooga campaign ends, and then it would be from here, in this position, that Thomas's forces will move through Ringgold Gap, and head down towards Tunnel Hill to begin the Atlanta campaign.
Well, that was fantastic. You're with the American Battlefield Trust, and I want to mention that Will said there's not a lot of the battlefield out here at Ringgold preserved. In fact, we're going to have an opportunity soon with the American Battlefield Trust to preserve just over 30 acres of this battlefield, so we'll be calling on you to help us. Some of the things to note that what Will said, I think continuity of command is a real problem out here on this battlefield. Joe Hooker, this is his first battle really, outside of Chancellorsville. He was sacked for a while. He comes out to the west. So when he comes west, Chattanooga, the Chattanooga campaign, this is his time to try to prove himself as a competent either corps commander or potentially an army commander. We also have out here some problems with the 12th Corps that he's bringing out onto here. We have John White Gary's division. Gary's a firebrand, if you will, for the Federals, and he's a guy who has fought well in the east, wounded at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, where we helped to preserve land. When he comes out here to the west, he lost his son at a place called Wauhatchie in October of 1863. But his men are going to be battered pretty badly, and one of the men who's going to fall there is a guy named George Sears Green, shot in the face. You might know him from Gettysburg fame. So that means David Ireland, who Will was talking about, took over Green's brigade. So this is Ireland's true test out here at Lookout Mountain and out here at Ringgold Gap. Ireland doesn't live too long. He's actually going to die of chronic diarrhea during the Atlanta campaign in 1864. Up over on top of the heights across the street, across the gap, will be William Crichton. He's in charge of Charles Candy's brigade, or a portion of Charles Candy's brigade. He's not a brigade commander normally. Crichton, you may have known him from a few of our other videos on our Western Swing at a place called Kessler's Cross Lane, and of course we were on Culp's Hill with him. Crichton's an interesting fellow, and he leads the 7th Ohio out to battle, even though he is a Pittsburgher, and they're known as the Roosters, and you may have seen one of the rooster badges that we brought out at Gettysburg just this past year. Crichton will be killed in action in some of that heaviest fighting behind me here at Ringgold Gap, and his men are known as the Roosters because allegedly Crichton would get up on a rock and crow like a rooster at the enemy and to get the men fired up out there. So this is a very hard battle. We, of course, have Claiborne and his men, Lucius Polk, Hiram Granberry, who will be killed at Franklin alongside Patrick Claiborne. But one important thing I think that comes out of this is Claiborne's a division commander. He's proven himself time and time again. During the winter of 1863-64, he is going to write a very controversial letter that is going to go up to high command for the Confederates, encouraging them to try to enlist enslaved people into the Confederate ranks. He claims that he sees the writing on the wall, that even if the Confederacy wins, that chattel slavery in the United States will be essentially ended. Well, he gets all of his brigade commanders and all but one regimental commander to sign off on this letter. It's forwarded on Army headquarters, and it is controversial to the end. Men like States Rights Gist and Henry Shot Pouch Walker are going to take offense to this and start calling Claiborne an abolitionist and calling some of those men traitors within the Confederacy. And some people think that even though he's one of the hardest fighting generals in the Army of Tennessee and perhaps the best division commander in the Western Theater, some people think that this letter is what is going to sink Patrick Claiborne, who actually stands beside that letter to the end. It will eventually make its way to Jefferson Davis. Some people thought that Claiborne would be upset that the President of the Confederacy would receive this letter from him, but he said, "I'm glad that General Walker sent it on to Jefferson Davis." But some people think that that may have tarnished his career as a Confederate officer. And in fact, some of the interpretive panels out here at Ringgold Gap talk about that incident. So if you get a chance to, we encourage you to come out to Ringgold Gap, check your emails, and check out battlefields.org to learn more about this potential opportunity we have here at Ringgold Gap for 30 acres that we can purchase out here and try to expand the battlefield here at Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. So for Will Green, Gary Edelman, Chris Mikowski behind the camera, I'm Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation.